There is a tin in your house. Maybe it's a cookie tin with a faded winter scene on the lid. Maybe it's a coffee can, or a mason jar, or a candy box shut with a rubber band gone brittle with age. And when you pick it up, it rattles buttons. Hundreds of them. Cut off coats that wore out 70 years ago by a woman who never threw away anything that might still be useful. She snipped them off, dropped them in the tin, and the coat went in the rag bag. That was simply what you did. And here's what nobody in your family ever thought to mention. That tin isn't a box of spare parts. It's a small, rattling archive of American manufacturing, and of the jewelers, potters, enamelers, and silversmiths who made buttons back when a button wasn't a fastener at all. It was jewelry with a loop on the back. In 1938, a group of Americans, a great many of them women who kept house and had no university behind them, founded the National Button Society. They weren't crafting. They built a classification system, close to the Dewey Decimal System, that collectors still use today. Those women understood something the rest of the country had forgotten. So tonight we're going through 15 kinds of buttons that turn up in American sewing tins and are worth far more than anyone in the family ever guessed. Number 1 is not really a button at all. Number 3 has sold for more than a house cost when you were born. And number 2, most people ruin with their own good intentions before anybody gets to appraise it. And the honest reason nobody ever taught you this? There's no product at the end of it. Nobody can bottle a good eye and sell it to you in a velvet box. An auction house doesn't build a spring catalogue around a coffee can, and the commission on a $5 button won't pay for the afternoon it takes a specialist to sort the jar. So the sorting never gets done. The knowledge isn't hidden. Nobody anywhere just makes a living handing it to you. One habit before we count. Every time you pick up a button, ask 3 things. What is it made of? What is stamped on the back? And is it alone or part of a set? Good light, reading glasses, a $10 magnifier. That's the whole toolkit. Number 15, the plain shell button, and the Iowa river town that made 1 billion of them. In 1891, a German immigrant named John Frederick Bopel began cutting buttons from freshwater mussel shells in Muscatine, Iowa, on the Mississippi. Within 15 years, that one river town was known as the pearl button capital of the world, turning out near 1.5 billion buttons a year, reportedly about 1/3 of the world's supply. Shells came by the wagon load from rivers across 19 states, and the National Pearl Button Museum in Muscatine still tells that story. If your people came from a river town in Iowa, Illinois, or Tennessee, somebody in your line may well have cut or carded those buttons for a living. Here's how you tell real shell from the plastic that replaced it. Turn it over. A shell button was cut from a curved shell with a hollow saw, so the back often shows fine concentric turning rings and a slight curve to the disc. The iridescence wanders and never repeats, because a living animal made it, not a mold. And shell never has a mold seam around the rim. Plastic does. Alone, an ordinary shell button is worth pennies, but learning to flip a button over and read its material is the skill that makes everything else on this list possible. Number 14. Vegetable ivory. The button that looks illegal and isn't. You find a creamy, carved, ivory-looking button. Half of you hopes it's elephant ivory. The other half is afraid to touch it because you've heard ivory is illegal now. Both feelings are usually wrong. For 100 years, an enormous share of American shirt and coat buttons were made from tagua, the rock-hard seed of a South American palm whose genus name literally translates to elephant plant. Under magnification, you can separate them. True elephant ivory shows Schrager lines, a faint crosshatch, like a weave in the grain. Vegetable ivory shows a fine, fibrous grain, more like a fingerprint, and often a small, dark fleck or hollow where the center of the nut was. No crosshatch, fingerprint grain, modest size. You're almost certainly holding a nut, not a tusk. And now the part that matters. In the United States, commercial trade in elephant ivory is banned under the Endangered Species Act, with only narrow exemptions. An item generally must be at least 100 years old and meet several other conditions. Several states go further. California and Nevada, for example, also restrict mammoth and walrus ivory. The Western Regional Button Association publishes a plain English guide called Buttons and the Law, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service answers specific questions directly. So enjoy your vegetable ivory freely. But if you think a button is real ivory, tortoiseshell, or anything from a protected species, don't list it for sale until you've checked federal and state rules. Number 13. Celluloid. And one piece of advice that runs against the grain. Celluloid was among the first man-made plastics, and by the 1890s it was everywhere. Buttons molded to imitate ivory, tortoiseshell, coral and horn, plus wonderful little figural novelties in the 20s and 30s. Now, you'll hear it said that yellowing proves age and is therefore a good sign. That's only half true. Celluloid is cellulose nitrate, and it doesn't simply age, it decomposes, giving off acidic fumes as it goes. Here's the part that costs families real money. A deteriorating celluloid button, sealed for decades in a closed tin, can corrode the metal buttons sitting right beside it while it destroys itself. So learn the warning signs. A surface that feels faintly sticky or oily. Fine crazing, like cracked glaze. A sharp vinegar or camphor smell when you open the tin. Rusty little halos on nearby brass, if you see those. Separate the celluloid from the metal. Keep everything cool and ventilated rather than sealed and warm, and never test it with heat or flame. Celluloid is genuinely flammable. That isn't collector superstition, that's chemistry. A crisp, figural celluloid button from the 20s can bring a very pleasant sum. A sticky, crazed one can't be saved by anybody at any price. Storage isn't a boring detail. Storage is the whole ballgame. Number 12. The hard rubber button, with a patent date stamped right on the back. This one delights me because it hands you a date. In 1851, Nelson Goodyear patented hard rubber, and the National Button Society notes that Goodyear patented buttons ran roughly from 1853 to 1872, which means a button you'd swear was a dull black plastic disc from 1960 may be older than the Civil War veterans in your family photographs. Turn it over. Hard rubber buttons commonly carry a molded backmark, a maker's name, sometimes a rubber company's initials, very often the word patent with a date. The material feels warm and light in the hand, never cold and heavy the way glass does, and it's matte rather than glossy. Sunlight fades it toward dull olive brown, so a crisp black one with sharp lettering has been kept in the dark. Don't soak it, don't scrub it, don't put it anywhere hot. Most bring modest money alone, but a hard rubber button with a legible patent mark is a dated American industrial artifact you can hold between two fingers. Number 11. Bohemian glass. Including the black ones everybody misjudges. In what is now the Czech Republic, around the town of Jablonek, whole villages spent generations making glass buttons. Pressed, molded, painted, gilded, and sold them by the barrel into the American market. The ones worth knowing: figural glass shaped like fruit, flowers and animals. Buttons with a swirl of glass forming the shank on the back, which collectors call swirlbacks. And the small marvel of the category, the paperweight button, where a tiny flower is suspended inside clear glass, made one at a time by hand. Now the black ones. Victorian America went through a very long fashion for black buttons, and people assume they're all jet or all worthless. Usually they're neither. Most are black glass. Here's a test you can do tonight with the flashlight on your telephone. Shine the light through the edge of the button. A great many 19th century black glass buttons glow deep purple or dark amethyst rather than true black because of how the glass was coloured. Glass also stays cold in the hand and gives a small clear tick against your teeth. Singles are inexpensive, but a fine paperweight button, or a crisp figural one with its gilding intact, is a real collectible, and a card of matched Czech glass is worth keeping whole. Number 10. The charm string. And this one, I suspect, will bring back a memory for somebody watching. From roughly the 1860s to about 1900, young American women collected charm strings, sometimes called memory strings. You threaded buttons onto a strong cord. And the rule, the lovely rule, was that a button could be given to you or traded, but never bought. The string hung in the parlour where visitors could see it, and callers were expected to bring one. The first, largest button was called the touch button. The folklore went like this: gather 999 buttons, and the 1,000th would come from your true love. Another version, which tells you a great deal about that era, warned that if you finished the string yourself, you'd never marry at all. These objects survive. The Keep Homestead Museum in Monson, Massachusetts, displays a charm string of 999 buttons that came out of a Vermont home, dated 1899, still with the trunk it was stored in. Now, my honest opinion, and some dealers will disagree, When a charm string turns up, the common move is to cut it apart and sell the good buttons individually because the pieces are easier to price. I think that's usually the wrong call. An intact, documented charm string with a known family behind it is far rarer than any single button on it. And once the thread is cut, the story is gone and can't be reassembled. You can always cut it later. You can never uncut it. Tell me in the comments if there's a string of buttons wound in tissue paper somewhere in your family, and whether you think it should ever be taken apart. I'd honestly like to hear the other side. Number 9. The Victorian picture button, and why the back matters more than the front. Pull out any dark, tarnished brass button from the 1800s and look at the front, because the Victorians told whole stories on a disc the size of a nickel. Fables, mythology, birds, cathedrals, dogs, opera scenes. Collectors call the most detailed figural ones realistics. But here's my differing opinion, and the one I'd most like you to keep. The picture on the front tells you what it is. The back tells you what it's worth. So turn it over and look for 3 things: a back mark, a stamped maker's name, and on many 19th century French buttons, a maker's name together with the word Paris, which is a genuine dating clue. The shank type. A soldard wire loop, a shank set into a little rosette of metal, a self-shank formed from the button itself. These changed across the decades and they date the piece. And any tiny riveted steel accents around the design, which collectors call steel cups, and which add real money when they're all present and not rusted. A worn, blurry picture button is decoration. A deep, crisp strike with an intact back mark is a collectible, and good ones reportedly change hands from the tens into the low hundreds of dollars. Number 8. Uniform buttons. Military, and everything else with a uniform. If any man in your family served, or there's an old jacket in an attic somewhere, look at the buttons before anything else. Military buttons carry a branch, a regiment, a period. But they carry something better on the reverse. The back mark, which names the maker and very often the city. Scoville, of Waterbury, Connecticut. The Waterbury Button Company, in that same valley since the early 1800s. Horstman, of Philadelphia. The wording of backmarks changed over time, which is why collectors can often narrow a button to a span of years from the reverse alone. The standard reference is Alpheus Albert's record of American uniform and historical buttons. And don't stop at the military. There's a whole American world here that gets overlooked. Railroad buttons, fire department, police, streetcar lines, hotel bellhops, steamship lines, school uniforms. If your father worked 40 years for a railroad, his uniform buttons are collected today by people who care deeply about that railroad. Now the honest flip, and it's a big one. Civil War buttons are among the most heavily reproduced small antiques in this country, and copies have circulated for over a century, some made as innocent souvenirs, which is exactly why they fool people now. Also know this: digging for relics on federal land is illegal under the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, and a romantic story about where a button was found is not provenance. Buy the button, not the story. Common examples run a few dollars. Scarce state seal buttons and identified sets have reportedly reached the hundreds and, as complete groupings, well beyond. Now, before the serious end of this list, the 2 things I say every time, because I mean them both. First, if you've already gotten up to go find the tin, do subscribe. That's genuinely how a small channel keeps going, and it costs you nothing. Second, the honest part. I am not a certified appraiser, and nothing here is a formal appraisal, a legal opinion, or an insurance valuation. I'm a friend who has spent a lifetime around old things, pointing out what deserves a second look before it goes in the donation box. Every price I give is what pieces have reportedly brought in the past. Condition, completeness, and the market on the day decide everything. Before you buy, sell, or insure anything of real value, have it seen by a certified appraiser, and check your own state and local regulations, especially for anything that might contain a restricted material. All right, now the good part. Number 7. Cut steel. And the Englishman who made steel sparkle like diamonds. In the 1770s and 80s, before electric light, a gentleman's coat could carry buttons studded with dozens of hand-faceted steel studs, each riveted through a plate so it flashed in candlelight like a small diamond. The great name is Matthew Bolton, of the Soho manufactory outside Birmingham. Buttons were one of that factory's principal products, and James Watt's rotative steam engine, the famous lap engine, installed there in 1788, drove the wheels that ground and polished them. Think about that. The partnership that helped power the Industrial Revolution was, at the same time, polishing buttons. The Victoria and Albert Museum holds examples and says plainly that cut steel buttons were both fashionable and costly, and Bolton's collaboration with Josiah Wedgwood, pale blue jasper cameos ringed in cut steel, is held today by the V&A and by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Here's your test. Turn the button over. Real cut steel is individual studs riveted through a backing plate, so the reverse shows dozens of tiny rivet ends, like a field of pinpricks. The imitation, and there's plenty, is one piece of stamped metal with the faceting pressed into the front and a smooth, blank back. The fronts look alike across a room. The backs tell the truth instantly. And one care warning that matters more here than anywhere else. Cut steel rusts, and rust destroys the value permanently. Never wash it, never soak it, keep it out of a damp basement, and leave any polishing to a professional. Number 6. Satsuma buttons. And a correction, most videos get wrong. These are tiny, hand-painted Japanese discs, exported to America and Europe from the Meiji era onward, roughly 1868 to 1912, largely by Kyoto workshops working for the Western market. Geishas, dragons, wisteria, and the crowded designs collectors call thousand faces. Now the correction, and I say it kindly because it's repeated everywhere, Satsuma is almost always described as porcelain. Properly speaking, it isn't. Satsuma is a cream-coloured earthenware, and one of the first things a specialist looks for is the fine crackle in the glaze, that little web of hairlines across the surface. The crackle isn't damage, it's characteristic of the body and the glaze. So under magnification, look for moriage. Raised gold you can actually feel as ridges under a fingertip. Faces painted with a brush of a few hairs, with real expression in them, and a natural, irregular crackle. Compare that with the modern Satsuma-style pieces circulating now. Faces that look blank or cartoonish, sometimes little more than dots, and a printed transfer, which under a loop breaks into a pattern of tiny dots with a hard mechanical edge, and the honest flip-on signatures. The great names, Kinkozan, Yabumezan, have been heavily forged for a century. Never buy on the signature alone. The rule specialists use is simple. The painting has to be as good as the name on the back. If the brushwork is stiff and the mark is famous, trust the brushwork. A crude late example is a modest thing. A finely painted, well-preserved Satsuma button has reportedly reached several $100s for one button. Number 5. Silver buttons. American, Mexican, and Scandinavian. First, Navajo. Diné. Silver work of the Southwest. Silversmiths made buttons in the concho tradition, often stamped and domed, historically sometimes worked from silver coins, sewn in rows down a blouse or a moccasin. Genuine hand-worked examples show slight variation in the stamping because a hand did it, and a hand-soldered shank rather than a machined one. Second, Mexico. Taxco became a great silver center in the 20th century, and buttons, conchos, and buckles came north by the thousands. Look for marks like sterling, 925, the word Mexico, sometimes an eagle assay mark or a maker's initials. And third, British silver carrying a full hallmark, which can date a piece to a specific year and city. One legal point, because it protects you. The Indian Arts and Crafts Act of 1990 makes it unlawful to market goods as Indian-made if they are not. So if you ever sell, describe only what you can prove. Say what the mark reads, say where it came from in the family, and don't guess at a maker to make it sound better. Honest descriptions protect you. And they get better prices, because serious buyers trust them. Silver buttons by known makers reportedly run from tens into hundreds of dollars each, and a full matched row is worth far more than the same buttons scattered. Number 4. Enamel. Coloured glass fused to metal in a kiln. By the late 1800s, French workshops were putting museum-quality enamel onto objects the size of a coat button. Firms like Piel Frères in Paris made extraordinary enamel and horn buttons in the Art Nouveau years. Learn the two words that matter most. Champlevé, where cells are carved down into the metal and filled with coloured glass. And Basté, where translucent enamel is laid over finely engraved metal so the pattern glows up through the colour like the bottom of a clear stream. Here's the test, and it's the most useful thing in this segment. Real fired enamel is glass. It's cold to the touch, glossy in a deep, wet way, sometimes finely crazed. And where it's chipped, look closely. It chips like glass and shows bare metal underneath. Cold paint, which is simply paint applied on top, does none of that. It wears away at the high points where fingers touched it. It can be nicked with a fingernail at the edge, and under a magnifier, a printed decal dissolves into a screen of little dots. Glass, not paint. That one distinction separates a few dollars from a few hundred. Number 3. The political button. And yes, this one has sold for more than a house cost when you were born. Here's a piece of American history most people have never heard. In 1789, supporters of George Washington wore brass coat buttons to his first inauguration. Real, sewn-on buttons, stamped with his initials and the words, "Long live the President." Those are the direct ancestors of every campaign button ever made in this country. Surviving examples have sold across a wide range, depending on size and condition, from the hundreds up into the thousands, and an appraiser on Antiques Roadshow estimated one large, well-preserved example at somewhere between $5,000 and $7,000 at auction. Then, in 1896, a New Jersey firm called Whitehead and Hoag popularized the celluloid pinback, and America went absolutely mad for them. Which brings us to the one collectors call the Holy Grail. In 1920, the Democratic ticket was James Cox for president, with a young Franklin Roosevelt for vice president. The party was broke, enthusiasm was thin, and almost nobody ordered the more expensive two-portrait buttons, so very few were ever made. Hake's Auctions in York, Pennsylvania, founded by Ted Hake, who literally wrote the book on this, called Button Power, reportedly sold a 1¼ inch Cox and Roosevelt button for $185,850 in 2022 and a 1-inch example for $100,300 the following year for a button. Now the honest flip, because this market is full of traps, reproductions and so-called fantasy buttons. Pieces made decades later that never existed during the campaign are everywhere. Look at the curl, the rolled rim on the edge. Original period pinbacks usually carry a maker's name or a union mark right there. Look for the paper insert on the reverse. And be suspicious of anything too bright and too perfect. The American Political Items Collectors, founded in 1945, exists partly to educate people about reproductions, and that's exactly who to ask. Tell me in the comments, is there a campaign button in your family from an election you actually remember voting in? Number 2. Bakelite and Catalin. The plastic that outperforms gold, and the mistake that ruins it. Leo Baekeland created the first fully synthetic plastic in the years around 1907 to 1909, and the phenolic plastics that followed. Bakelite, and the cast version sold as Catalin, became the darling of collectors. The colours people chase are butterscotch, deep cherry, the translucent yellow collectors call apple juice, and anything deeply carved or laminated in 2 colours. Now, 2 honest corrections, because this is the most misinformation-soaked corner of the hobby. Correction 1. You'll hear that a seam or mould line proves a piece is modern. That's too simple. A great deal of period phenolic was compression moulded and does carry parting lines. Catalin was cast into rods and sheets, then machined and carved. A seam is a clue, not a verdict. Correction 2, and this is the expensive one. The tests themselves can damage the button. Harsh household cleaners strip the aged surface, and a stripped, dull piece sells for less than an untested one. I have watched people scrub the value straight out of an object. The gentler method most collectors settle on is a very small amount of simichrome polish on a cotton swab, applied to a hidden spot on the back. If the swab picks up a yellow-brown residue, you're very likely holding phenolic. Wipe the spot with a little mild soap and water and dry it immediately. Don't polish the whole button, don't test the front, don't use anything caustic, and keep cleaners off your skin and away from your eyes. Weight and sound help too. Phenolic is dense for its size and gives a deep, solid click rather than a light plastic tap. Plain examples are modest. Deeply carved and figural Bakelite buttons have reportedly reached into the hundreds of dollars for a plastic button. Which tells you everything about how collecting actually works. Rarity and craftsmanship beat raw material, every single time. Number 1. The button that was never a button at all. Before machines learnt to stamp buttons out by the million, buttons were made by jewelers. Goldsmiths made them in solid gold and silver gilt. Enamelers painted miniature scenes on them and sealed them under domed crystal. Lapidaries set them with hardstone, with rose-cut diamonds, with pearls. A wealthy man in the 1700s could wear more money down the front of his coat than a farmhand earned in 20 years. And that was precisely the point. The V&A and the Metropolitan Museum hold 18th century button sets that are, by any reasonable definition, fine jewelry. And here's an American story I love. In 1964, a New York book editor named Diana Epstein bought the entire stock of a closing button shop on the Upper East Side, more or less on impulse. An antiques restorer named Millicent Safro wandered in looking for a replacement button, and the two of them went on to run tender buttons in Manhattan for more than 50 years. In an interview with public radio in New York, the shop's range was described as running from about 40 cents for an ordinary shirt button to $17,000 for a single engraved 18th century metal button. Same shop, same little discs. So how would you know? Wait. Real gold and silver feel heavy and cold for their size, and stay cold. A mark. Turn it over and read the backplate and the shank slowly, under magnification. For a hallmark, a carat number, a maker's stamp. Construction. A hand-drawn wire shank soldered on by a person, slightly irregular rather than machine perfect. And completeness. A graduated set with its original card or case is a far greater object than the same buttons loose in a jar. And one warning I will not soften. Do not test gold at home with acid. Those kits use strong acids that can burn skin and eyes and give off fumes, and a home test on an antique can permanently damage it. If you believe you're holding gold, that is the moment you stop, put it somewhere safe, and take it to a certified appraiser. Real gold and gemstone buttons have reportedly reached thousands, and exceptional jeweled sets far into the tens of thousands at the major auction houses. So, what ties all 15 together? 2 rules, and then I'll let you go find the tin. Rule 1. A button's value almost never comes from being a button. It comes from the material, the mark, and the age. Exactly like jewelry, because a great many of these literally are jewelry with a loop soldered on the back. That's why the reverse matters more than the front on nearly every item tonight. Rule 2, and this is the one that costs American families the most. A set is not the same object as its parts. One military button is a few dollars. A complete identified grouping is something else entirely. One check glass button is pocket change. A full matched card is a collectible. And a charm string, once cut, can never be made whole again. So when someone offers you cash for the whole jar on the spot, and someone will, understand what is actually being bought. Now the honest ending, because this channel doesn't sell fairy tales. Most buttons are worth pennies. Most tins hold 500 ordinary buttons and 3 that are interesting. The prices tonight are what remarkable examples have reportedly brought, and remarkable means remarkable. But here's the arithmetic that makes an evening of sorting worth it. Looking costs you nothing but good light and an hour. Emptying the tin into the trash, or handing it over for $10 at a yard sale, has cost families things they'd have wanted their grandchildren to have. So go get it. The cookie tin, the coffee can, the jar in the back of the sewing drawer. Pour it out on a towel on the kitchen table, turn them over, and read the backs. Then come tell me, what did you find? A creamy carved one with fingerprint grain? A dull black disc with a patent date on the reverse? A tiny painted face under a magnifier? A string of buttons wound in tissue that nobody has touched since your grandmother died? Describe it in the comments, and I'll tell you honestly whether it's worth carrying to someone. And I'd love to hear your side of the charm string argument, because plenty of people disagree with me there. And remember, always, before you buy, sell, or insure anything of real value, have it examined by a certified appraiser, and check your own state and local regulations first, especially for anything that might contain a restricted material. Take care of yourself. Take care of the tin, and don't let anybody talk you into emptying it before you've looked. I'll see you next time.